In the previous video, we refactored this application that simulates making queries against Wikipedia. We did that by using functional decomposition. We used to have all of the logic in one method, and we split it up into separate methods. One of the problems that we identified was temporal coupling. The search button required the query field to be created before the search button itself could be initialized. We also have a curious call here, where in creating the search button, we have to add listeners to the query field. Now that may have set off some alarm bells in your mind. That seems like it shouldn't be necessary to modify query field to make search button work. What we're missing here is an observation that there's a property of this UI that we have not explicitly represented, and that is the idea that a query is currently possible because there is text in the text field. Remember what this event listener here does. It looks at the query field, sees if there's text in it. Trim simply takes off whitespace from the beginning and end of the string, so really this is just saying, is the query field empty? And if the query field is empty, we disable the search button. JavaFX gives us the ability to represent this kind of a property explicitly using properties. Let's see how we can use that to make this implicit model explicit. The first thing I'll do is add a new property here. This will be a Boolean property, and we'll call it search enabled. In fact, we can immediately instantiate this as a simple Boolean property. It will start as false. I like to make instance variables final whenever I can, and so because we're only ever creating this one instance and assigning it to search enabled, this is a good candidate to be made final. Now, if text field exposed a property that told us whether or not there was any text in it, we could immediately bind this property to that one. However, text field has no such property, and so we'll have to do a little bit of that extra work ourselves. For now, let's go down into when we create the query area, and here we can set up a property binding. It looks like this. Here I'm creating a new anonymous inner class which will contain the logic for my binding. I use Alt-Enter to implement the missing methods. There's just this one. And in this case, we want to say that text is available when the query field has text in it. Well, one way to do that is like this. Again, I want to consume the white space, so I'm using the trim method. This is the same logic we have elsewhere in the file, checking to see if there is anything in that text field that is not just white space, and we simply negate it to see whether or not text is available. Now there's a trick here we need to use in order to connect this binding to the text field. We'll use an initializer like this. This sets up a binding so that this Boolean binding is evaluated whenever the text property changes on the query field. What value does this Boolean binding get? Well, that's determined by compute value. So this section of code here sets up a Boolean binding that will be appropriate for determining whether or not text is available. Okay, let's connect our search enabled property to that. So now, whenever this changes, search enabled should be updated as well. We've put this logic into create query area because, to me, it's part of the initialization of the query field itself. Now, all we have to do is go down to where our button was created and use this property. This is a bit of an awkward method name. This is not disabling a property, which you would assume if every method is a verb phrase. This is actually accessing the property, which is called disable. I know that's a bit awkward, and I wish they had used enable instead, and I wish this method was named properly as getDisableProperty, but here we are. So what is this saying? Look at the disabled property of the search button and bind it to whether or not search is enabled. Now, again, I'm using the positive sense because I believe that's a clearer way to program. JavaFX designers, in a fit of madness, use the negative sense of disable. So we're going to have to turn this around. Fortunately, the API gives us an easy way to do that. Okay, let's try it. You see how the search button is enabled? If I erase my text, it's disabled again. If I have only white space, it stays disabled, but when I type in more characters, it becomes enabled again. So now we've taken what was previously implicit, this idea that search is enabled, and we've made it explicit in this property. Of course, any refactoring wouldn't be complete without going through and looking at the code we changed and making sure that we're following all of the principles of good programming. There's a little white space gap here that I don't really like. Let's put our final fields together. That feels a little better to me. Now the only other methods that we changed were create query area and create search button. One thing that jumps out at me is we still have this kind of a kludge around the idea of temporal coupling from last time. Now we've eliminated that problem entirely, so we don't need that line at all anymore. Now whether or not you want to put this binding here within create query area is an interesting problem. Notice that even as I typed it in, I left some white space around it. Well, that indicates to me that it probably belongs somewhere else. Let's go ahead and pull that out. And I think what I'd like to do, contrary to what I said a few minutes ago, is move it out of this method entirely. That will make it more clear to the reader that this is not actually dependent on the query area being initialized. Okay, so now what we have is a new step as part of our UI creation. After we make these three pieces, we'll go ahead and configure the search enabling. Maybe that's not the best name. Make it more clear that this links with that property. I think that's looking pretty good. Of course, always a good idea to run the application again after refactoring. If we were refactoring in the model, we would run all our unit tests. Unfortunately, with this approach, we're stuck with manual testing. That looks pretty good. So that's another way that we can improve our program. We took something that was implicit in our minds, and we made it explicitly represented as a property. Now the astute observer may notice that there are parts of this application that deal exclusively with the problem of managing the input, and there's other parts of this application that deal strictly with producing the output. Doesn't that sound like two different responsibilities? Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll look at a more object-oriented decomposition. And as always, happy programming.